A lonely cowboy with a heart as vast as the plains he calls home meets a stranger during a stormy night. What starts as an act of kindness quickly becomes something neither of them expected. In the depths of that storm, two worlds collide, and one unforgettable night changes everything. But will their connection survive when the morning light breaks? Stay tuned for a story that will make your heart race and your soul ache. Jackson Bennett's life was a quiet one, built on routine and hard work. For the past 20 years, his days had been defined by the sunrise and sunset, the needs of his horses, and the rhythm of the seasons. He wasn't just a farmer. He was a caretaker, pouring his love into the animals that relied on him. They were his family, his purpose. But no matter how much he convinced himself that this solitude was enough, there were nights when the stillness of the farm felt like a weight he couldn't shake. This night, however, was anything but quiet. The storm had rolled in with a ferocity he hadn't seen in years. Thunder rattled the windows of his farmhouse, and lightning painted the sky in jagged streaks. Jackson stood in the barn, securing the last of the horses in their stalls. The animals were restless, their nervous snorts and stamping hooves echoing in the confined space. "It's all right, girl," Jackson murmured to one of the mares, stroking her neck. His deep, soothing voice seemed to calm her. "It'll pass soon." As he bolted the door to the barn and made his way back to the house, the rain came down harder, soaking through his flannel shirt. He quickened his pace, longing for the warmth of his fireplace, but just as he reached the porch, a sound cut through the storm. Faint, but urgent. It was a knock at the door. Jackson paused, his brow furrowing. He rarely had visitors, especially not in weather like this. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the road leading to his farm wasn't exactly well traveled. Cautiously, he stepped inside and approached the door. The pounding came again, louder this time. When he opened it, his breath caught. Standing there, drenched and shivering, was a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a dream. He was young, probably no older than 25, with blonde hair plastered to his forehead and piercing blue eyes that seemed to glow even in the dim light of the storm. Water dripped from his clothes, pooling at his feet. "Please," the man said, his voice trembling from the cold. I had an accident. My car skidded off the road and hit a tree. I didn't know where else to go." For a moment, Jackson could only stare. The stranger's beauty was almost otherworldly, and something about the desperation in his expression tugged at a part of Jackson he hadn't acknowledged in years. Finally, he found his voice. "Come in," he said, stepping aside and motioning for the man to enter. "You're going to freeze to death out there." The young man hesitated, his body trembling violently. "I don't want to impose." "You're not imposing," Jackson cut him off, his tone firm but kind. "Now get in here before you catch your death." The man nodded, stepping over the threshold. As Jackson closed the door behind him, the sound of the storm was muffled, replaced by the crackling of the fire in the living room. "You're soaked to the bone," Jackson said, his eyes scanning the man's dripping clothes. "Take those off, and I'll get you something dry to wear." The man looked at him startled. "Oh, I don't want to ruin your floor." Jackson let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "My floor will survive. You, on the other hand, might not if you stay in those wet clothes. I'll grab some towels and a change of clothes. Wait here." Jackson disappeared into the hallway, returning moments later with a pair of flannel pajamas and a thick towel. He handed them to the man, his fingers brushing against the others briefly. The contact was fleeting but enough to send a small, unexpected jolt through him. "Thank you," the man said quietly, accepting the items. "There's a bathroom down the hall," Jackson said, his voice gruff to mask his sudden unease. "You can change in there." The man nodded and disappeared down the hallway. Jackson stood in the living room, running a hand through his damp hair. His heart was still pounding, though he couldn't tell if it was from the storm or the stranger who had just walked into his life. When the man returned, he looked warmer, more relaxed. The flannel pajamas hung loosely on his lean frame, but the soft fabric seemed to suit him. "Better?" Jackson asked. "Much," the man replied with a small smile. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to," Jackson said, motioning for him to sit by the fire. "What were you doing out here in this weather?" The man sank into the armchair, letting the warmth of the fire seep into his bones. "I was on my way to visit some friends in the next town over. Took a wrong turn and ended up on some back road. The storm hit, and before I knew it, I lost control of the car. Skidded right into a tree." Jackson nodded, his arms crossed as he leaned against the doorway. "You're lucky you weren't hurt." "Luckier than I feel," the man said with a rueful chuckle. "By the way, I'm Ryan. Ryan Carter." "Jackson Bennett," Jackson replied, offering a small smile. "Welcome to my little corner of nowhere." Ryan's smile widened, and for the first time, Jackson noticed how it transformed his face, softening the sharp edges and making him look younger, almost boyish. "Well, Jackson Bennett," Ryan said, his tone light but warm, "I think your little corner of nowhere just saved my life." Jackson chuckled softly, but the sound faded as his gaze lingered on Ryan's. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside, for the first time in a long time, Jackson felt a flicker of something he thought he'd lost. Connection. And he wasn't sure he was ready for what that might mean. The warmth of the farmhouse wrapped around Ryan Carter like a blanket, easing the chill that had seeped into his bones during the storm. As he sat by the roaring fire, clad in Jackson's oversized flannel pajamas, he felt a strange sense of calm he hadn't known in a long time. This place, rugged, remote, and alive with the earthy smell of wood and leather, was a stark contrast to the sleek, impersonal world he was used to. And Jackson Bennett, the man who'd taken him in, was unlike anyone he'd ever met. Jackson handed Ryan a steaming cup of coffee, his rough hands brushing against Ryan's fingers briefly. "This should help," Jackson said, his voice low and steady. "Thank you," Ryan murmured, his blue eyes meeting Jackson's for a moment before darting back to the fire. He took a sip, savoring the rich, slightly bitter taste. It was a small but comforting gesture, one that made the storm outside feel worlds away. Jackson settled into the chair opposite him, his tall frame illuminated by the firelight. His gaze lingered on Ryan, as if trying to piece together the story of the man who had shown up at his doorstep. There was something about Ryan's presence that unsettled him, not in a bad way, but in a way that stirred emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "So," Jackson began, breaking the silence, "what brings you all the way out here? Don't get many travelers in these parts." Ryan smiled sheepishly, running a hand through his still damp blonde hair. "Honestly, bad planning. I was on my way to visit some friends in the next town over. Thought I could take a shortcut, but I guess my GPS didn't account for dirt roads and falling trees." Jackson chuckled, the sound deep and warm. "Sounds about right. These roads can be tricky, especially in weather like this. Ryan glanced at him, studying the sharp angles of his face, the strong jawline, the faint stubble, the deep green eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 untold stories. "And you?" Ryan asked, curiosity getting the better of him. "Have you always lived out here?" Jackson nodded, leaning back in his chair. "Born and raised. This farm's been in my family for generations. My parents passed it down to me when they retired, and I've been taking care of it ever since." Ryan tilted his head, intrigued. "And you've been here all this time? Alone?" Jackson hesitated, his gaze dropping to the fire. "Yeah, it's just me and the horses now. It's not a bad life, quiet, steady, but lonely," Ryan added softly. Jackson's eyes flicked up to meet his, and for a moment there was a vulnerability there that took Ryan by surprise. "Maybe," Jackson admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The room fell into a comfortable silence, the crackling of the fire filling the space. Ryan shifted in his chair, his thoughts racing. There was something magnetic about Jackson, a quiet strength that drew him in. He had expected the night to be a disaster, but instead, he'd found himself in the company of a man who seemed to embody everything Ryan had been searching for without even realizing it. "You're good with people," Ryan said suddenly, his tone thoughtful. Jackson raised an eyebrow, surprised by the comment. "I don't know about that. Don't get much practice out here." "No, really," Ryan insisted, leaning forward. "You could have slammed the door in my face, but you didn't. You welcomed me in, gave me clothes, made me coffee. You didn't even hesitate." Jackson shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Didn't seem right to leave you out there. Anyone would have done the same." "Not anyone," Ryan said quietly, his gaze steady. Jackson didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared into the fire, the flickering flames reflected in his eyes. "I guess I know what it's like to feel stranded," he said finally. "To need help and not know where to find it." Ryan's chest tightened at the raw honesty in Jackson's words. Without thinking, he reached out and placed a hand on Jackson's arm. The touch was gentle, but it carried a weight that neither of them could ignore. "You're a good man, Jackson," Ryan said, his voice soft. Jackson looked at him, his expression a mix of surprise and something else, something unspoken. "You don't even know me," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Maybe not," Ryan replied, his fingers lingering for a moment before pulling away. "But I think I'd like to." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Jackson's heart raced, and he found himself at a loss for words. He had spent so many years convincing himself that he was fine on his own, that he didn't need anyone. But now, with Ryan sitting across from him, he felt those walls beginning to crack. "You must be tired," Jackson said finally, his voice gruff as he stood. "There's a guest room down the hall. You can stay there tonight." Ryan hesitated, as if reluctant to let the moment end. "Thank you," he said, standing as well. "For everything." Jackson nodded, his green eyes locking onto Ryan's blue ones for a fleeting moment. "Good night, Ryan." "Good night, Jackson." As Ryan disappeared down the hallway, Jackson sank back into his chair, staring into the fire. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions he didn't quite know how to name. But one thing was certain. His life, so carefully built on solitude, was no longer as unshakable as it had seemed just a few hours ago. And for the first time in years, he didn't know whether to feel terrified or hopeful. Jackson couldn't sleep. The storm outside had calmed to a steady drizzle, but inside him, a storm of emotions raged on. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, staring into the darkness beyond the window. The image of Ryan, his golden hair catching the firelight, his blue eyes brimming with warmth, refused to leave Jackson's mind. He hadn't felt this alive or this unsettled in years. The sound of soft footsteps broke through his thoughts. He turned to see Ryan standing in the doorway, wearing the flannel pajamas he'd lent him. His hair was tousled, and there was a faint sleepiness in his eyes. "Couldn't sleep?" Ryan asked, his voice gentle. Jackson shook his head, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Storm kept me up." Ryan smiled faintly as he sat down. "The storm's over." Jackson's lips twitched in a half smile. "Maybe it's something else then." Ryan tilted his head, studying him. "You're not used to having company, are you?" Jackson chuckled softly, leaning back in his chair. "Is it that obvious?" "A little," Ryan admitted, his smile widening. "But it's kind of endearing." Jackson's chest tightened at the word, endearing. He wasn't used to compliments, especially not from someone like Ryan, someone who seemed so vibrant, so full of life. "What about you?" Jackson asked, his voice low. "What's a city guy like you doing out here, really?" Ryan hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table. "Honestly, I needed to get away. Things back home have been complicated." Jackson nodded, sensing there was more to the story, but not wanting to push. "Well, you picked a hell of a night to go on an adventure." Ryan laughed softly, the sound warm and contagious. "Yeah, I guess I did, but I'm glad I ended up here." Jackson looked at him, his green eyes searching Ryan's face. "Why is that?" Ryan's expression softened. "Because I met you." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Jackson's heart thudded in his chest, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to this, to someone seeing him, really seeing him, and not turning away. "You don't even know me," Jackson said quietly, echoing the words he'd spoken earlier. Ryan smiled, leaning forward slightly. "Maybe not, but I'd like to." The intensity in Ryan's gaze was almost too much for Jackson to bear. He stood abruptly, turning toward the counter under the guise of refilling his coffee. "It's late. You should get some rest." Ryan hesitated, then stood as well. "Jackson." Jackson turned to face him, his jaw tight. "Yeah?" Ryan took a step closer, his blue eyes unwavering. "Thank you for letting me in, for helping me. You didn't have to, but you did. That says a lot about the kind of man you are." Jackson swallowed hard, his throat tight. "It's nothing," he said gruffly. "It's not nothing," Ryan said softly. "Not to me." Before Jackson could respond, Ryan reached out, his fingers brushing against Jackson's arm. The touch was light, almost tentative, but it sent a jolt through Jackson's entire body. "I'll see you in the morning," Ryan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jackson nodded, unable to speak. He watched as Ryan disappeared back down the hallway, his footsteps fading into silence. Alone again. Jackson sank back into his chair, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He couldn't deny it any longer. Ryan had stirred something in him, something he'd long buried, and he wasn't sure he was ready for what that might mean. The next morning, the farm seemed to glow under the soft light of the rising sun. Ryan woke to the sound of horses neighing and the faint clatter of tools outside. As he pulled on his clothes, he felt a strange sense of anticipation. The man who had taken him in, who had shown him kindness and warmth, was more than just a stranger now. Ryan found Jackson in the barn, tending to the horses. He was dressed in a worn plaid shirt and jeans, his movements confident and practiced. The sight made Ryan's heart skip a beat. "Good morning," Ryan called, leaning against the barn door. Jackson turned, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Morning. Hope you slept all right." "I did," Ryan said, stepping inside. "Thanks to you." Jackson chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You give me too much credit." Ryan watched him for a moment, then stepped closer. "Maybe you don't give yourself enough." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that neither of them could ignore. As the morning sun filtered through the barn, illuminating the dust motes in the air, Jackson felt his resolve weakening. Ryan wasn't just passing through, he was breaking through into a part of Jackson's heart he'd long thought closed off. "I was thinking," Ryan said, his tone lighter now, "maybe I could help you out today. You know, earn my keep." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "You know anything about farm work?" Ryan grinned, his blue eyes sparkling. "Not a thing. But I'm a fast learner." Jackson laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "All right, city boy, let's see what you've got." As they worked side by side, laughter and conversation filled the air. For the first time in years, the farm didn't feel quite so lonely. And for Jackson, that realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. Ryan's first attempt at farm work was both a comedy of errors and a testament to his determination. Jackson found himself alternating between laughing at Ryan's clumsy efforts and admiring his resilience. Whether it was lifting bales of hay, mucking out stalls, or trying to saddle a particularly stubborn mare, Ryan threw himself into each task with enthusiasm. "You sure you don't want to go back inside and wait for the car repair guy to show up?" Jackson teased as Ryan struggled with a pitchfork. Ryan wiped the sweat from his brow, his blonde hair sticking to his forehead. "Not a chance. I'm not letting you do all the work while I sit around. Besides, I think I'm getting the hang of this." Jackson smirked. "If you say so, just don't let Ginger here kick you." Ryan glanced at the horse, who seemed to be eyeing him with mild irritation. "Noted," he said, backing away cautiously. The banter between them came easily, and by the time they broke for lunch, Ryan felt like he'd known Jackson far longer than a single night. They sat on the porch, plates of sandwiches balanced on their laps, the quiet hum of the farm surrounding them. "This place is incredible," Ryan said, gesturing to the sprawling fields. "It's so peaceful." "It has its moments," Jackson admitted, his green eyes scanning the horizon. "But it's a lot of work, and it's not for everyone." Ryan looked at him, his expression thoughtful. "But it's for you." Jackson hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, it's my home. Always has been." There was a pause, then Ryan asked, "Don't you ever get tired of being out here alone?" Jackson stiffened slightly, his gaze dropping to his plate. "Sometimes, but it's easier this way. Less complicated." Ryan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Easier doesn't always mean better, you know." Jackson glanced at him, surprised by the gentle challenge in his tone. "And what about you? What are you running from, city boy?" Ryan's smile faltered, and for a moment Jackson thought he might deflect the question. But then Ryan sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Honestly, myself," Ryan admitted. "I've spent so much time trying to be what other people expect me to be that I don't even know who I am anymore. Coming out here, I guess I thought maybe I'd figure it out." Jackson's chest tightened at the vulnerability in Ryan's voice. He wanted to reach out to offer some kind of reassurance, but he wasn't sure how. Well, he said after a moment, you're not alone in that. Figuring yourself out, I mean. Ryan looked at him, his blue eyes searching. Really? Jackson nodded, his gaze steady. Yeah, I've been doing the same thing for years. Still don't have all the answers. Their eyes met, and in that moment the air between them shifted. It wasn't just the easy camaraderie of two people getting to know each other anymore. It was something deeper, something unspoken. Ryan set his plate aside, leaning back against the porch railing. You know, he said, his tone lighter now. I think I'm starting to like it out here. Might even stick around for a while. Jackson raised an eyebrow, his lips twitching in a faint smile. You're welcome to stay as long as you need. But if you're going to keep working on the farm, you might want to invest in some proper boots. Ryan laughed, the sound warm and genuine. Deal. But only if you promise to keep teaching me the ropes. Jackson's smile widened. I think I can manage that. As the afternoon wore on, they returned to the barn, the day's work continuing in a steady rhythm. But the unspoken connection between them lingered, growing stronger with each passing hour. The next morning came too quickly. The storm had passed, leaving the air fresh and calm. Ryan's car was still damaged, but with Jackson's help, they managed to make it roadworthy again. The silence between them was heavy, not awkward, but weighted with everything left unsaid. As Ryan packed up his few belongings, he turned to Jackson. Last night, it meant a lot to me, he said quietly. Jackson nodded, his green eyes filled with emotion. Me too. Ryan hesitated, then asked, Will you be all right? Jackson forced a small smile. I've been all right for 40 years. I'll manage. But Ryan wasn't convinced. Ryan's car idled at the edge of the dirt road, his hand lingering on the door handle. This isn't goodbye forever, he said firmly. I'll come back. Jackson stood a few feet away, his heart aching as he nodded. I'll hold you to that. Ryan smiled, leaned out the window, and said, Take care of yourself, Jackson. As the car disappeared down the road, Jackson stood there, the dust settling around him. The ache of Ryan's absence was immediate, but so was the hope. He turned back to the farm, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Somewhere out there, Ryan was thinking of him, and that was enough for now. If you enjoyed this story, let us know by leaving a rating from 1 to 10 in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of Jackson and Ryan's connection? Did the stormy night pull at your heartstrings? Also, tell us if you'd like to see this story continue. Should Ryan come back to the farm? What could happen next? Your feedback means the world to us, so drop a comment below and share your ideas.